You're listening to Secret Sonics, a podcast exploring the creative side of music production. Join us weekly for honest conversations with real-world music producers and audio professionals. Welcome back to Secret Sonics. I'm your host, Ben Wallach. As you can hear in my voice, I don't feel terribly well right now. I had a bit of a cold, and then I also had stomach poisoning. And I know what you're thinking. I really don't think it's corona because none of these symptoms are corona symptoms. And I've had colds before in my life, and I've had food poisoning in my life, and I'm pretty sure that it's one after the other. But due to that and the fact that it is the Jewish New Year, I'm not posting a new episode this Sunday like I usually do, and I'm just going to push it off till Monday, tomorrow. So if you're waiting for a new interview, you're going to have to wait till tomorrow. But today I decided, because I always publish on Sunday, let me just put a little bonus episode in. And I'm just going to include, I did this Facebook Live a bunch of months ago, back in like the heart of lockdown era, about my approach to mixing, my philosophy, how I go about mixing music. And it's just like, could be an interesting perspective for you if you're interested in mixing at all. So I'm just going to put that in at the end of this episode. And yeah, I'm going to leave it unedited and raw how I did it on Facebook, and enjoy it if you want to stick around for it. Other than that, I hope you guys have a great day and a great week. And if you are Jewish, or even if you're not Jewish, I hope you guys have a great new year, Shana Tova, as we like to say in Israel. And, 2020 might not be over, but at least the Jewish calendar year of 5780 is finally over. So maybe things will start to turn around now. And let's hope for a really good year, a much better year than the year we had. Thank you, everybody who has listened. It really means the world to me. I'm going to keep at it, and we're going to keep making great episodes. So, all right, stick around. I'll see you next time. So what I'm going to do today is a live Q&A about mixing. And if anybody has questions, they could just pop it here in the feed. Let's just wait a little bit to get people going, for people to kind of join us. I'll just have a sip of my Gold Star beer, and l'chaim to everyone here. I see one person is watching right now, which is great. Everybody's welcome. I'm also recording this to Logic in case anybody wants to hear this later on, just in case we want to do add it to the podcast backlog in case I get stuck for an episode 1 week. So yeah, l'chaim. Everybody should have a good night. Stay safe out there. Cheers. Wow. Okay, so until I get any actual questions in the chat, we're gonna. I guess I'll talk about my philosophy when it comes to mixing. We'll just kind of start there, and then we'll diverge off of that. So basically, when I'm mixing music, I think of every track as kind of like a little stream, and these streams kind of all run together in parallel, and they join up into bigger rivers, and then eventually they all go out into the ocean. So in my analogy, those little streams of audio could be anything. It could be a drum track, it could be a bass track, it could be a vocal, it could be, a xylophone, for example. And all of these instruments, all these tracks, vocals, instruments, all that stuff, I try to sort them so that things are more organized, and I have more control over the gain and the gain staging of my tracks. So so then I'll send those kind of streams into a bigger river, which is like a submix, like a group. You can call them a VCA, you can call them a track stack. That's what they call them in Logic, or just like a bus or an auxiliary channel. They're referred to all these kinds of things. And so these little streams turn into rivers. And then all these rivers, these auxiliary channels, or buses, if you will, go into the ocean, which is the stereo bus, which is the final output of the mix. And obviously on that, so in every stage, you can affect things with different, tools such as compression and EQ and reverb and all these things. Actually, I'll talk about effects kind of are a little bit, they kind of, it's a kink in my analogy, but you'll have to bear with me and use your imagination a little bit. But basically, every channel. So let's start with that. There's all these streams, and then the streams go into the rivers, and then the rivers go into the big ocean. So
moving top to bottom, or moving from like the river down or upstream towards the smaller creeks and little things, the more you put on, basically on the ocean, it's going to, like the stuff you put on the ocean is going to affect things earlier in the chain. So it's kind of like, think of a guitar pedal, how there's like a chain of effects, right? So like the first thing you put is your compressor, and then the compressor goes into, your fuzz box, and your fuzz box goes into your delay, which goes into your reverb. I don't know. I'm not really a guitar player, so effects chains on guitars are not necessarily my forte. But, everything, if all of them are activated, the one that gets affected first, or, man, I'm not really making sense. Well, the one that everything affects everything down the line, right? But at the end of the line, in the ocean, let's say I put a compressor on the ocean, it's going to compress or let's use a simpler analogy of an EQ, right? So let's say I do a high pass filter, and I take out a lot of the lows on the ocean, the stereo bus, meaning everything in the mix is passing through that high pass filter. There's not going to be any low end on any instrument in the mix. Whereas if I put the high pass filter only on the vocal, you'll cut out the lows on that vocal, but you won't cut it out. It won't have any effect on the kick drum. So what I like to do is do things at every stage that I think will help the mix, and a lot of smaller things towards, let's say, the end of the chain will help me. It will be easier for me to do the mix earlier on in the chain. So by doing stereo bus compression, by having, I usually use the Waves SSL compressor because it just kind of gives it that polished record sound, and people like to refer to it as the glue. If any of you guys don't know what dynamic compression is, that maybe this is not the right course for you, but I'll just give a brief description of what dynamic compression is. Compression is, when an audio signal passes a certain threshold, the compressor will knock it down by a certain ratio, and basically that's how you keep dynamics in check. So, the only way to understand what compressor is to play around with one. And if you have GarageBand even, or, any DAW, it'll come with a free compressor pretty much. And then you could just play with the knobs or the digital knobs until you kind of hear what it's doing. And it has a sound to it, like overcompressed drums has a sound to it. The example of overcompressed drum sound is, let's say, like the drums, just as they enter in Exit Music to a Film off of OK Computer by Radiohead, like just those drums, that's like the sound of an overcompressed drum kit. But I'm going way ahead of myself because basically what I'm trying to say is that if I do compression on the stereo bus, if I'm doing dynamic compression on the stereo bus, on the ocean, it literally is compressing everything in the mix. So by doing, like, I don't know, a dB or two of compression on my SSL compressor on the stereo bus, aka the ocean, I'm going to have to do less compression on the vocal channel because everything's being a little bit compressed and a little bit, tightened up, dynamically speaking. So that's kind of how it works for me. So like the end of the chain, I'll have a compressor and I'll have an EQ, and the EQ is doing a little bit of low end and a little bit of top end boost so that I don't have to do as much boosting to make things sound a little bigger and in your face. And I think I have a little bit of like 1K just to get a little bit, 1K, like 1,000 hertz is kind of how I feel like, it's like legibility almost. I think of it. It's just whatever. It can add to things being clear, like clarity. I think actually on guitar amps, when the presence knob is about 1K, because that kind of like helps things poke through. So I'm doing a little bit of that usually. Obviously not always. There's no, dead fast rules. But yeah, so I'm doing that stuff on the stereo bus. And then down the line, I'm affecting groups of instruments. So for example, on the drum bus, I'll probably have another compressor compressing all of the drums together, and maybe an EQ doing little EQ movements on all of the drums together. And I find myself like when I'm about like 2/3 through a mix, I'm doing a lot of like mini EQ adjustments on the buses. And the buses are where I'm basically, like as I said, like the drum bus where all the drums go. There's also usually an electric guitar bus, an acoustic guitar bus. So all of these like little streams of acoustic guitars are being sent to this river that is the acoustic guitar bus. And then the acoustic guitar bus, that river goes into the ocean, which is the stereo bus, alongside in parallel with the drum bus. And obviously these are made up instruments for a production that doesn't exist. But usually these things exist. The keyboard, let's say a keyboard, I have it set up so I have a keyboard bus. I also have a pad bus, because pads function a little differently than, let's say, a piano or a Rhodes or an organ or even a synth lead. So I have basically a bus for pretty much any conceivable instrument combination. So I'm going to do when about 2/3 to the mix, as I was saying earlier. I'm kind of doing like these micro EQ adjustments to get everything kind of working together, because that's kind of where I'm doing my puzzle piece, just fine tuning. Like, I made the guitar sound as good as I could, but now they're not necessarily working as well with the vocal. So let's like cut out a little bit of the low mids that are competing with the vocal, let's say 200, 300 hertz in the acoustic guitar, and we can maybe add another 800 hertz. Like, this is just a typical, situation, but not necessarily a rule to live by, because I think the guitar still needs a little bit needs to poke out now that I've gotten rid of some of the low mids. So I'll boost a little bit of the more mid mids, where it's not competing with the vocal, let's say, for example. So I'm doing a lot of these like little micro puzzle piece, if you will, adjustments on the EQ of the buses about 2/3 into the mix, kind of after like everything is sounding good, but like I just want it to sound a little bit more precise, and that there's less fighting between the instruments and the vocal and all that stuff. So I'm using all these buses as rivers, right? Like, as I said. And then on the individual tracks, let's say the streams, those little creeks or whatever, it's as needed. And so oftentimes by the time I'm doing, the ocean compression and EQ, and I'm doing the bus, maybe compression, maybe EQ, sorry about that burp, just drinking beer here. And usually on the buses is where I'll put like tape saturation and maybe stuff like subtle distortions to make things kind of poke through a little bit better. Obviously, only the bass goes to the bass bus, and it's usually the only instrument. So I can kind of decide if I want to affect the individual creek or the river. It doesn't really matter. It's just about whatever I'm feeling. But it also gives me a chance to automate and make levels, rebalance things in different places. So sometimes I'm automating the actual track, like the guitar needs to go up, so I'll turn it up in the guitar track, or I'll just clip gain it. For those of you who don't know what clip gaining is, that's where you literally just boost up the gain of a section of the audio file so that it just sounds louder. So like, if I sang hello, and the next time I sang hello, I sang it much softer, like hello, and I wanted that second hello to be as loud as the first hello, I could just literally go in and make that second. It's called clip gain. Basically, you highlight the section of the track, at least in Logic. I'm sure it's similar in Pro Tools or any other DAW. And you just raise it up a tiny bit via clip gain, and then you don't have to do as much compression, or it could be instead of automation. That's usually how I use it, is instead of automation, because then I don't have to open up the automation. Once I'm opening an automation, it's usually towards the end of the mix, because then things kind of get, it's harder to kind of just like change up the faders really quickly. And, once automation is in play, you're kind of hopefully fine-tuning the mix. So rather than do automation, but I know something needs to be louder, I'll use something called clip gain. I feel like I'm going off on a lot of tangents, and I'll try to be a little bit more coherent. But so what I started doing a few months ago, so in addition to my buses going into my stereo bus, I actually have buses going into buses. So I started using the track stacks within Logic, which is a feature that kind of like tracks go into a track. So it's literally the same thing as a bus. It's just visually it's easier to use in Logic. And then that bus I send into the bus. So for example, I now have a sub-mix of the acoustic guitar bus, which is rhythm acoustics and lead acoustics, or lead electrics and rhythm electrics. And I have like, let's say for like lead vocals, I'll have like ad-libs, and even like verse and chorus going into, and like that could even be like subdivided. So there could be like 4 different ad-lib tracks in the ad-lib sub-bus going into the lead vocal bus, going into the stereo track. So it kind of sounds complicated, but it really gives me so much more control over my mix, right? Like, it just gives me so many more stages where I could change the volume or the gain. And for me, like the gain equals the balance equals how the mix sounds together. And